Yeah, I will.
All set? Okay, well, good afternoon all. It's great to see everyone. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank the Department of Biology, Shauna Dukes, our fantastic LEC fellows, and Wen for helping put on today's seminar. Every year, the students of the EPB program here at Washington University elect to invite one external speaker per semester to visit WashU and give a seminar to the department and meet with students and postdocs and faculty across campus. And the students of EPB this semester have elected to invite Dr. Graham Reynolds to campus, who comes to us from Asheville, North Carolina. As an undergraduate, Graham attended Duke University, advised by Susan Alberts, conducting research on magic traits of dart frog and anima. Graham joined the lab of Ben Fitzpatrick at UT Knoxville for his PhD, where he focused on the population genetics of curly-tailed lizards and Boas in the Turks and Caicos Islands. And now one might say that, well, no Caribbean herpetologist journey is complete without studying anoles. So Graham traveled up to the northeast of Boston upon finishing his PhD and joined the lab of Liam Revel at UMass Boston as a postdoc in 2011, and developed and applied new methods in comparative biology. Graham then joined the lab with Jonathan Lozos at Harvard as a postdoc in 2014, where he continued research on the evolutionary genetics and phylogeography of squamate reptiles across the Caribbean. In 2016, Graham returned to North Carolina, joining faculty in the Department of Biology at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, where he currently resides as an associate professor. His research combines the newest approaches in evolutionary genomics with classical field-based natural history research from the Smokies in North Carolina to the West Indies. Graham is also an associate at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, a National Geographic Explorer, and a Red List co-authority for the IUCN Snake Specialist Group. He has co-authored 2 books on the amphibians and reptiles of Tennessee, and has another currently in press titled Boas of the West Indies, Evolution, Natural History, and Conservation. But perhaps, more importantly, Graham was also my undergraduate advisor and mentor, and was pivotal in instilling an appreciation for the role of natural history and the role natural history research plays in studying evolution and ecology. I remember one day before zoology practical, as a sophomore, which was a course that Graham taught, I was invited to go sample rare salamanders in the Smokies with colleagues from Tennessee. Stressed about not having prepared for the practical and wanting to go search for salamanders, I simply asked Graham, what should I do? Graham didn't say anything. He just sat there, smiled in response. Well, I did not do well on that practical, but I was the first person in the lab to go find a South Mountain gray cheek salamander. So, you gotta balance things. So Graham's a biologist who understands learning happens in the classroom and the lab, but also out in the field where you can get your hands in the dirt. When I finished my first year of grad school at WashU, Graham mailed me a copy of the Amphibians and Reptiles of Missouri, which had a note written on it and said, "Congrats on finishing your first year of grad school. This is a book I use in graduate school. Enjoy and go find some of these." Well, Graham, I'm now in my 3rd year of graduate school, and there's a new version of this book out, and all I'm saying is, I think you owe me a new book. So it brings me immense joy to welcome to campus as the fall 2022 invited speaker, and his talk today is titled "The Relative Roles of Contingency, Determinism, and Stochasticity in the Evolution of West Indian Boas." Please join me in welcoming Graham.
Oh, thanks, Ari. Thanks, Ari. It's so cool to be able to come up here and see all the great stuff that you're doing here in this park. And thank you all for the invitation. What a pleasure to get to visit with you all today. I really, really appreciate this. I love getting to visit new campuses and meeting with you all, hearing from the graduate students. And so by way of thank you, I want to say that I have to click on this. That's not what I wanted to say. I did a reverse honorarium, and I believe in giving back to your community And so when I visit a community, I like to give back in some way. So I gave a honorarium to State Connections, which is your local domestic violence shelter in St. Louis. I say this not to virtue signal, but instead, many of you are students and postdocs. You're going to find yourselves in different communities throughout your academic career. You're going to find yourselves in new towns, new cities. You're going to not know anybody. You're not going to have any connections. And I think one of the best ways to start to develop a connection to these new communities is to get involved, to give back, to give your skills and your energy back to the community, because then you become part of that community. So just a little bit of advice there, unsolicited perhaps. All right, why islands? Well, I probably don't have to tell too many of you why islands, but when I give talks, especially for graduate students, I like to tell you a little bit about my journey, just so you can kind of see like how I got to be doing the things that I'm doing. So it started for me being excited about islands as a kid. When I was 8 years old, I was in the Bahamas, and I saw a boa in the Bahamas being eaten by a cat. And that struck me because, first of all, I didn't know there were boas in the Bahamas. And second of all, I had no idea a cat could eat an adult boa. And so that sort of served as a inspiration for me. I remember coming back, this is me as a kid in the Bahamas. I remember coming back and thinking, this is before the internet, right? To age myself. Trying to figure out what we knew about these boas. I was really excited about having seen one and learned more about them. And it turns out it was hard to find a whole lot of information about these boas in the Bahamas, and that's because nobody was really working on that. Well, that sort of stuck with me over the years. And so I ended up in college at Duke, as Ari said, and before that, I'd gotten really interested in Stephen Jay Gould's writing as a high school student. I read most of his books, and Gould has this funny sort of way of being able to explain all kinds of different aspects of science. Everything from baseball to the connections with, ecological relationships. Anyway, I remember reading The Wonderful Life, and this quote, many of you are familiar with: "Replay the tape of life a million times, and I doubt anything like Homo sapiens would evolve again." And that stuck with me like an itch, because I just didn't feel that could be the case, right? I started to think that there was something else to this. It couldn't just be that easy, that you would get a different outcome every time. And so thinking more about it, I started to think about what Gould was thinking about when he was saying this word convergence. And it turns out when Gould was writing about some of this, he actually used two separate definitions for convergence. So in some cases, he's referring about the dependence on something else, dependence on history to reach a specific outcome. And if the specific events in history don't happen in the same way, you get a different outcome. Okay? But he also said that it's an accidental or a chance event, that there's some unpredictability in outcomes from identical starting points. These two definitions aren't necessarily compatible if you really start to drill down to it. This all was very confusing to me as a high school student. So I went to visit Stephen Jay Gould when I was 17. I drove down to Duke. I was not a student there at the time, but he was giving a talk on questioning the millennium. So I wanted to go down there and question him about some of this. Well, you can imagine how that went. He didn't answer my questions, but I stayed till after the talk, and I got to meet him. And I asked him, I said, "Well, okay, I've got a different question for you. I want to be an academic biologist. What's the best advice you can give me?" He said, "It's important that you think and learn broadly." Remember, some of you who know Gould, you know that he's an anti-reductionist. And he actually said, don't let your education be focused on following threads down to the basics of life and then expecting nature to be clear. You need to think broadly and learn broadly. Okay, that's great advice. And then he's like, "I gotta go," because the World Series is starting. He's like, I gotta watch this game. So that was really neat. That was a neat experience for a 17-year-old. And Gould passed away 3 years after this, and so I never did get to ask him some of these questions. But these sorts of lessons and these ideas and the itches persisted. And I got to Duke and I studied poison dart frogs. And part of the inspiration here was that I wanted to see if I could understand what are the mechanisms contributing to these biodiversity outcomes that we see. Right? We go to islands, we see an outcome of processes producing a certain collection of biodiversity. Can we start to understand what processes and mechanisms lead to those biodiversity outcomes? And so this project was focused on thinking about magic traits, as Ari brought up, and these are traits that are simultaneously ecologically important, okay, so presumably being acted upon by natural selection, but also important in natures. So sexual selection, natural selection acting together to produce really fast phenotypic evolution. That's a magic trick. That's the basic idea. And so we found evidence that this was in fact the case, but it didn't quite solve what was going on here. I mean, we see that when you look across this archipelago in Panama, you see all of these different phenotypic outcomes in a single species of frog. And so what we're trying to reveal to us is like, where does this come from, right? These frogs are only 6,000 years separate from one another. So how do we get all this phenotypic diversity? Well, the mechanism, it turns out, is probably this really strong natural selection, sexual selection, operating on this trait color pattern, which is so obvious to us, right? What else is different about these frogs? Pretty much nothing else, just their color. But it's a striking difference, right? Because we're focused on color and pattern and shape. That was just part of it. I call this a Mercian rebuttal. Simon Conway Morris famously rebutted Stephen Jay Gould's ideas about sort of the fact that humans were not an inevitable outcome. And in this book, Life Solution, this came out in 2004 when I was in college, he says, convergence is ubiquitous. I can't think of anything that has only evolved once, or there are very few exceptions. There's the qualifier, right? This is actually not in this book, but it was an interview that Simon Conway Morris gave. The idea here is that convergence could be everywhere. What does that tell us about the inevitability of evolutionary outcomes? Could there be some determinism in this process? In other words, might humans actually be inevitable? And so these ideas were really challenging for a young biology student, I think. But I had to take it to the islands again. I had a mentor in grad school, Dan Simberloff, some of you might know Dan, he's a friend of mine. And he said, if you're going to work on islands, you might as well work on islands that look like this, right? I mean, Dan had great advice. Dan worked in the Florida Keys for his PhD work. And so I took that to heart, and that's where I started working, trying to unravel some of these ideas about determinism, stochasticity, convergence, some of these other things that might be contributing to biodiversity on islands. And so this leads me to the Boas. When you go to these islands and you start looking for Boas, you make some interesting observations. You see some Boas that are small and colorful, and you see some that are giant. You might go to an island, an uninhabited island that no herpetologist has surveyed, and you find a big Boa laying there. What does that tell you about biodiversity assembling in these islands in the West Indies? This is actually from a new population I found just in March. Some Boas love to live in trees. They are very, very arboreal, like these two, the silver boa from the Bahamas, the Virgin Islands tree boa. Some of them have this really interesting non-boa phenotype. In fact, those of you who know snakes might recognize this as looking an awful lot like a non-boa from the mainland of Central America. This is a Karuban snake. This is a remarkable example of a potential mechanism operating here, convergence. Two different lineages. Well, some of the boas are enormous. The Cuban boa can reach over 4, possibly 5 meters long. Some boas specialize on eating lizards. Some boas like to eat birds. These are all the observations that you make, and you start to think about, can we peel back the layers here to think about how natural history observations might drive how we approach understanding the evolution of boas in the Caribbean. This is an interesting observation here. This is the ratio of female to male body size. And you can see that we see some sexual size dimorphism, and some of it's pretty astounding. Okay, here's an example. I know you all are seeing this. I need you to look very carefully at this. That is a full-grown male on the left and a full-grown female on the right. That is a big difference in body size. Might you expect these to be ecologically different? Plausible, right? Yeah, plausible. Okay, so these kinds of observations. Ontogenetic color change, another interesting observation where juveniles are orange and red and they transition to gray color. We see that in some species, but not others. All of these are natural history observations, and they are the fuel for what comes afterwards. Now, I have to credit Harry Green for this quote in his book, Snakes, one of the classic books on snakes. I'm going to read it to you. Greater Antilles boas offer exciting possibilities for untangling vicariance and dispersal as underlying causes of distributions and speciation on islands. So here's Harry not only appreciating that these West Indian boas might be interesting, but he's offering some ideas of things to test. Thanks, Harry. So let's get down to it. We want to think about the relative roles of contingency, determinism, stochasticity in helping to build this biodiversity outcome that we see on these islands. So first off, contingency, getting to the islands. This is a reconstruction of the Caribbean during the Miocene, about 20 million years ago. This is from a geologist. And so you can see that we have a series of islands. We would call these the Proto-Antilles. Okay, it looks vaguely familiar for those of you who've seen maps of the West Indies before. We can see that some of these islands are pretty close to Central and South America. And it turns out that this time period, the Miocene, 20, 25 million years ago, is crucial in the history of these boats, because that's when they got to these islands, during this time period. And so the first thing we wanted to do was to figure out, how did they do that? How did they colonize these islands? And so we established sort of, some basic principles here. Number one, that ocean currents were probably involved. So we can look at the prevailing ocean currents throughout the Greater Antilles and the Lucayan archipelago, which includes the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos. We can also think about hurricane tracks as being generally unidirectional through this region, and probably hurricanes and water currents are involved in the distribution of these boas. So we wanted to test this. Okay, this is thinking about actually using a statistical test to estimate ideas or models for historical biogeography. So we came up with 4 different models. Model 1 is a prevailing current model where dispersal happens from Central and South America linearly through the Greater Antilles. Model 2 is a prevailing current but branching model. It allows for a little more ability to colonize islands, not strictly stepstone or strictly linear. Model 3 is a countercurrent, a current countercurrent restricted model, where these boas could colonize this region, okay, but they could also move in this direction, again, against currents, okay, but with a restriction that was not as likely. Or we could have a full model, where the boas could just move at will without regard to currents or hurricanes. Okay, these are 4 ideas for how dispersal colonization might have happened in the history of the boas. And so we can test this. And we tested this using a dispersal extinction cladogenesis model. Okay, that was kind of a prevailing model we used a lot about 10, 12 years ago when we did this. And we find evidence, we find support for model 2. That probably, as we might have predicted, boas are colonizing this region with influence from currents and hurricane settings. That's not entirely surprising, but it's nice to see the model reveal that. All right. So boas are colonizing this region, but then they're also undergoing cladogenesis over the intervening time period. Colonization of the Miocene, and over the next few million years, diversification. And so I'm going to flip between these. This is the Pliocene about 5 million years ago. This is the Pleistocene about 2 million years ago. Look what's happening. Okay, the islands we're seeing, the islands coalesce into what they look like today. All of this history, the geologic history of the region, is a component driving the diversification of boas. That's the contingency part, right? Undoubtedly related to how these boas began to speciate, disperse, is related to the geologic history of the region and how they got there. But also, I think part of this is, what did they find when they got to these islands, right? Who else was there? We can think about potential competitors being there. I like to teach my students about competition, I would say with a capital C, because it's such an important concept in ecology, right? So competition, potential competitors, these are the numbers of snake species that could be potential competitors on each of these islands or island groups. So notice Cuba's got over 28 species. About 18 or more of those are one genus called Tropidotus, probably overlapping ecologically with some of these other boas. Jamaica, 7 species, but look, the Lucayan archipelago, 3 species, Puerto Rico Bank, 2 species, Hispaniola, 13 species. Well, if we start to look at how many boa species are present, Cuba, 1 boa species on this big topographically diverse island. Could that be because of competition? Plausible. Hispaniola, there are 4 boa species, but Hispaniola has a lot of diversity. of reptiles and amphibians and various other things. Puerto Rico, only 2 species possible competitors. There's 3 boa species in Puerto Rico Bank. And the Lucayne Archipelago, 3 possible competitors, 5 boa species. Could boa diversification be related to what other competitors they found in the islands? You bet. These are aspects of contingency, right? I mean, what happened before? History matters in determining outcomes. Now, the next part of this is determinism. If processes like mutation, if we can sort of expect that oftentimes those are stochastic, could natural selection act as a determinism filter? In other words, can we expect to see things like convergence happening on larger scale radiations? Well, let's start to think about this. When we think about convergence, you have classic examples, right? I never liked this example, by the way. This is a textbook example, but look, like dolphins and sharks and whales are all kind of the same shape, right? That's not a great example. I think we got much better. Okay, so maybe collectively as educators, we can do away with this. I don't know, maybe you can push back. But here's some observations we make when we look at these boas. We see big boas and we see small boas. Here's some small ones. Hispaniolan Russell boa, that's as big as they get. That's me holding an adult female. Hispaniolan vine boa, that's a species we discovered last year. That's as big as they get. When we look at big boas and small boas, we see that the smallest boas are about 1/2 meter in length. The largest boas, 5 or more meters in length. That's a big difference. That's a big difference. This has to mean something, right? Well, we can think about what these different size groups look like on different islands. When you go to Hispaniola, there are 4 boa species. 3 of them are small and 1's large. And interestingly, the large species is a generalist, ecologically and with its diet. The small species are specialists. They tend to be arboreal and have specialized diets. That's on Hispaniola. Well, go to Puerto Rico and Puerto Rico Bank. 1 large species, 2 small species. The large ones are generals, small ones are specialists. You're seeing a pattern developing, right? You go to the Lucayne Archipelago. 5 species, 1 large generalist, 4 specialists. This is a process that has undoubtedly unfolded over and over again. So we want to understand, is this convergence or is this something else? Well, we can test that with phylogeny, and that's what we did. So we can map onto the phylogeny body sizes. This is just a heat map where the hotter colors are larger size, larger body size. You can see here's our largest species, the human boa. And we can see our small species distributed throughout the phylogeny. In other words, we find evidence that small body size has evolved over and over and over again. It's happening in situ on each of these major islands. Does that sound familiar to those of you who study anomalous lizards? I think that sounds familiar, right? Yeah, that's a familiar pattern. Okay, so here we have evidence suggesting deterministic outcomes. Ancestral boas colonize a greater Antillean island, they speciate, and one species will specialize, 1 or more species. 1 will be a generalist. And that pattern is repeated. That smells like determinism. We can kind of break these into 2 flavors of boas, big boas, small boas. And we can start to think about specific types of specialization, dietary specialization. Many of these are going to be specializing in feeding on anomalous lizards. Some of them are specializing in certain habitats, like arboreal habitats. Okay, so if we start to classify our boas based on these types of specialization, or whether they're generalists, we want to ask ourselves, are we seeing correlation between body size evolution and specialization? And so the way we want to test that, or the way we did test that, is using a threshold model. The threshold model is borrowed from quantitative genetics. Okay, and this is the idea here is that we have discrete character states. So whether you're a specialist or not, whether you're a big boa or a small boa, these are discrete states. But we understand that these discrete states are evolving because of underlying quantitative trait evolution. Right? Body size is a quantitative trait. But when you get to a certain size, could it be that as you evolve small body size, you get to a certain size and you flip into becoming a specialist? That's what we're testing. Okay, so we're testing that discrete character state, but we're modeling that using these underlying what we call liabilities. And that's the threshold model. These different colors are discrete character states, but we're modeling the flip between character states based on some underlying quantitative traits. So when we apply the threshold model to these data, what we find is we find evidence for specialization, transitions to small body size, being associated with specialization in habitat. Okay, so we can see that on the top here, habitat liability. We see specialist and generalist. We see that when the boas get small, they become habitat specialists. And that's happened over and over again on different islands and great reserves. But we don't find strong evidence for this in the dietary specialization. And so we had to think about, well, why could that be? And part of the reason, for those of you who appreciate natural history, like some of you that I talked to today, is because we didn't have great dietary data for some of these species. We did not know enough to be able to effectively test this. So how do we figure out what these things eat? Is that the easy part or the hard part? Arguably, the hard part, right? This is easy to do. We could do this on our laptops on the weekend, but to go out and figure out what a species of boa eats day in and day out, that takes time. We're still working on that. I think we can improve this model with some more of those data. It's really a call to those who are interested in generating natural history. You can't test these kinds of evolutionary ideas without solid understanding of the biology of the species. Well, here's where we are. We know that small body size is associated with habitat specialization. As the boas speciate on these islands, they evolve small body size and they specialize. It's happened over and over and over again. The evidence for dietary specialization, perhaps not there. Okay, what about stochasticity? Now, is randomness baked into this? Might you expect it to be? I think so, yeah. Well, let me just pause right here and say, well, if we're trying to understand biodiversity outcomes, we're thinking about the evolutionary mechanisms, processes that are responsible for these biodiversity outcomes, might we expect some aspect of stochasticity? Plausibly. Might we expect some aspect of determinism? Yeah, probably. What about contingency? You bet. So what are we doing here? If we already know that contingency, determinism, and stochasticity are involved in generating biodiversity outcomes, what are we trying to do? We're trying to determine what is contributing to what. How are these contributing to the biodiversity outcomes? That's the whole layers of the onion, right? That's what we're trying to figure out. Okay, so it's not about trying to determine whether these mechanisms are operating. It's about how they're operating. So we might ask, stochasticity, okay, well, are we seeing natural selection being a comprehensive deterministic filter, or is there some randomness associated with this? Okay, so here's how we're going to do that. So as boas evolve small body size, something interesting happens. If you give them the old eyeball test and you look at their heads, the small species of boas look neotenic. They look like juveniles. Over here on the left, that's an adult. There's a 1-year-old of the same species, and there's a neonate, the third one down. Those are all the same species. These last three are 3 separate species of small boas from different islands. They look kind of baby-faced, don't they? I mean, I think so. Yeah. So could there be something interesting? You got to look at a lot of boas. So we might ask ourselves, does ecological specialization affect the rate of cranial evolution? And are these small boas, do they really have the same shape of head as one another? Now we can test that. So we measure them. By the way, these are the kinds of measurements we take. This is just standard linear measurements. And we can do a phylogenetic PCA, principal components analysis. And what we find, what we're looking for in this 3-dimensional space here, is we're looking for clustering. Clustering of generalists, clustering of specialists. But we don't see that. In other words, these boas, we're calling them specialist generalists. And they are acting ecologically in that way. We've shown that they are indeed specialized in some aspect of their ecology. But they're not doing it in the same way. Their heads are different shapes. There is no small head phenotype that's a conserved and convergent phenotype. Specialization is occurring independently, but in different ways. Okay. Well, it's not quite the end of the story there. We also want to see, well, what about rates of evolution? Is something happening as the boas are evolving small body size? Are evolutionary rates ticking up in terms of their cranial evolution of that particular phenotype, shape of the head? And we'd use a rate by state model to do this. Rate by state. The state is the ancestral habitat or diet liabilities from our threshold model. And the rate is head shape evolution, using these data that we've gathered from measuring foreheads. So we estimated rates of cranial shape evolution and ancestral habitat and diet liabilities for each of the nodes in our tree. And we compared this to a Brownian motion process. So we're just simply asking, do we see elevated rates compared to null expectation? And we do. We see elevated rates of evolution, cranial evolution, head shape evolution, for boas that are specializing on habitat, but not diet. So in PC2, PC3, we're seeing elevated rates. PC2, we're seeing a little bit of evidence here for diet, but again, I think that we just don't have great data on diet, so I don't want to put too much weight on it until we have better. Are we feeling like we understand the boas a little bit more now? Anyway, okay, we're gonna land this plane in a second, but let me show you this first. Most of these things that I've just shown you, we did these 10 years ago. We need to extend the model because we have new data. Prophetically, in 1944, Netting and Goyen say subsequent collecting in the Bahamas will yield additional herpetological novelties and possibly even other representatives of Epicrates. That's the old genus name for these boas. They said that in 1944. Nothing came of this until a few years ago. 10 years ago, when we were doing some of this work that I just showed you, we only recognized 9 species of boas in the whole genus. That's rather modest radiation. Not a whole lot to work with there. But look what's happened. We described number 10 in 2013 based on molecular data. That's the Bahamas boa, newly recognized species. We also elevated the Virgin Islands boa in 2015 based on molecular data. These are what we refer to as cryptic species. Very, very evolutionarily divergent and not previously recognized. Number 12, that was a fun one. I'll tell you the story of this one. This is a good one. So this is the silver boa. We were doing work on Anola Sabri Island, which is a widespread anola across the Caribbean. We were going to lots of different islands, including some really remote islands. Conception Island is in the Bahamas. It's one of the more remote islands in the Bahamas. Uninhabited, it's a national park, there's nothing there, it's difficult to get there. So we went out to Conception Island collecting anoles, but also, doing other kinds of surveys. And one of the interesting things is that herpetologists tend to specialize and do either daytime or nighttime, but not often both in terms of their surveys. So herpetologists have been out to Conception Island numerous times, but you know what? Nobody stayed overnight. Well, we did. And guess what we found? A brand new species of boa, the silver boa. And in fact, Nick Herman, who was one of our graduate students in the Law Society at the time, came on the radio right about dusk, and he said, guys, I got a snake over here. We're like, not supposed to be any snakes here on this island. Like, well, it's a big snake. You might want to get over here. Nick was like a first-year graduate student. So we went over there, and sure enough, there's this boa lying there. He said, whoa, that doesn't look like anything we've seen before. Well, scientists, you don't get too excited, right? Well, we spent the rest of the night looking. We found 4 other boas, so 5 total. Got really excited. We took all our samples, took all the data. We laid down on the beach to get a quick nap before the boat came to get us in the morning. Well, about an hour into our sleep, about 4 a.m., I feel something on my head. I reach up and grab it, and it is a full-grown boa that had crawled on top of my face while I was sleeping. So I grabbed it and I said, okay, that's a boa. So I put it in the bag and went back to sleep. And I woke the guys up about an hour later and said, we got one more measure before we could leave. That boa had crawled out of the forest across the beach and on top of my head. I've never heard of that happening to anybody else. I think I must have really smelled like other snakes at that point. But anyway, this is a special species because we have since come to realize that this is the most endangered boa species in the world. They have a total habitat area of about 5 hectares. There are fewer than 200 adults alive. That's the census population size. Well, many of you all probably know the 505,000 rule, right? Where you get below 500 individuals in terms of census population size, and the outcome does not look so good when you're thinking about saving endangered species. So that's where we are with these. And so it's obviously something that causes us to lose a little bit of sleep at night. But that's a very special species, and that's one that we're working on actively. This species in the Crooked Acklands Islands in the Bahamas, there was a boa, a subspecies that had been described from a bunch of dead material collected in the 1970s, but we had no photos of live wild specimens. So we mounted an expedition in 2017 to go look for them. And sure enough, we found them. And it turns out they're a totally different species. They're their own unique species. They're actually sister to the silver boa. So we describe them as the Crooked Acklands boas. That's number 13. This is the last 10 years. Look at all these new species. We're not finished yet because just last year we described a new two from Hispaniola, number 14. Right, this is the vine boa, and this is the smallest boa of the whole group. Only 0.5 meter maximum body size. It might be one of the smallest members of the family. We don't know for sure. We haven't seen enough of them to really make that statement. But in the last 10 years, we've gone from 9 to 14 species. That's a 55% increase in diversity, recognized diversity. So we have to extend this model. Do these species fit the model that I've already offered to you as an explanation for how we come to understand the evolution of these boas? And the answer is, yeah, we think so. The small boas, the new ones that we found, they're all specialists. Habitat, and it turns out probably diet. So we feel pretty good about how we understand the evolution of boas. All right, let's land. Where are we? We're up in the air. We got all these ideas swirling around about evolution. Let's think about contingency. Here's our conclusions. The vicissitudes of dispersal and colonization are undoubtedly related to the biodiversity outcomes that we see. That's not a profound statement. Okay, but it's awesome to be able to think about how that actually unfolded, to have models that we can test, to think about what might have happened in the Miocene that led to the current distribution of these species. We can think about the influence of currents and hurricane cells. We can test those in a model tested framework. And we can think about co-distributed fauna and island topography as potentially being related to the biodiversity of the sea. Again, these are not profound statements, but it's interesting that we can test them and they can contribute to our understanding of boa biodiversity. Number 2, determinism. The phylogeny shows in situ speciation on Greater Antillean Islands. Small boa species, they didn't evolve once and disperse. They evolved over and over and over again. Ancestral colonists evolve repeatedly in large and small boas. Small boas are consistently specialists. Specialization evolved over and over and over again, and large boas are consistently generalists. And finally, we see repeated evolution of habitat specialization. What about stochasticity? Well, this convergence that we are feeling like we're seeing, it doesn't operate on traits the same way in each species. We don't see that head shapes are all the same in small species. They're evolving small body size, they're evolving specialization, but their trophic morphology doesn't match one another. There's some randomness baked in. Small boas, they do evolve small heads at elevated rates. But small heads are not convergent in their shape. Contingency, determinism, stochasticity contributing to the biodiversity that we see. Not surprising, but it's fun to be able to pick out what is contributing what. If you like what you see, we have our book coming out in March. I'll be happy to send a copy to the department when it comes out. And Jonathan also was nice enough to write the foreword for this. So thank you, Jonathan. Much appreciated. Speaking of Jonathan and books, this is that book, Improbable Destinies. I was a postdoc with Jonathan when he was on sabbatical writing this book, and so I feel a certain connection to it. I don't know if that's fair. Jonathan can tell me afterwards. But I might say that I've gone in my career from a Gouldian to Lososian. Keep going to the term. Evolutionary convergence is completely ubiquitous. This is quoted from Jonathan Lossos. Wherever you look, you see it. Rerun the tape of life as often as you like, and the end result will be much the same. That is the inverse of what Gould was telling us in Wonderful Life. Where is this coming from? It's coming from evidence that we see across nature of convergence. Simon Conway Morris pointed out to us the importance of convergence. He said it's absolutely everywhere. He's never seen an example of not having some kind of, that's an overextension. But what Jonathan is saying is that convergence matters, right? But that's not the full story. The platypus, he gives us this example, is a one-off in the sense that there's nothing else quite like a platypus. But that doesn't mean that there's not convergence in play, because a platypus has traits that are convergent with other species. It's an amalgamation of traits. Well, just like anything else, right? Just like anything else, perhaps? Well, we don't like to say that evolution is random, because we understand that natural selection acts like a determinism filter in many cases. And we see them. We see evidence for this. There are many possible paths that can be taken in terms of our biodiversity outcomes. Evolution repeats itself sometimes, but often it doesn't. That makes sense, right? Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So, hence, I would say, a Lososian view is one in which both contingency and determinism shape evolutionary destinies. And I think that's why he titled the book this. Now, he's not here to correct me, but I told him that he's got to correct me if I'm wrong. I think the book is titled Improbable Destinies because it implies that the convergence is a major component of evolutionary outcomes, but there's some wiggle room there too. And that contingency plays a role and stochasticity plays a role. I don't know, is that fair? You all can agree or disagree with me. All right. I've been working on Boas for 17 years. And I just want to point out that one of the most joyful things that we do as scientists is work with other people. And as you all become educators, I mean, many of you already are in terms of TAs and moving forward, but perhaps one of the biggest joys is seeing that spark in your students. All right. Seeing that spark and seeing people get excited about science, and especially seeing my students get excited about Boas. These are some of the students that I've worked with over the years. This is Alyssa Vanarelli, a PhD student now in Anthony Geneva's lab at Rutgers County. So these students are going on, doing their own great things. And I can't leave this talk without showing a picture of Ari. This was Ari's senior thesis. We worked in Vietnam together, based on a grant that Ari had gotten. This is a picture of Ari after having gone for a dunk in a pool of water on a very remote island in Bai Tu Long National Park in northern Vietnam, way off the coast of Vietnam. That set of toms that he has belongs to George Zug, who was his mentor at the Smithsonian. George Zug is a very well-known herpetologist, loaned Ari that set of toms to take to Vietnam, and Ari dropped them in the water. And I said, well, you got to go get them. So that's what he did. Swam down there, grabbed them off the bottom of the pool, came back up. Speaking of joys, Ari came back from this trip and he said, I think I found a new species of snake. When your undergraduate comes up to you and says that, that's pretty exciting. And sure enough, he was right. Ari discovered a new species of snake in Vietnam. That was his senior thesis. Science can sometimes feel oppressive. It can sometimes feel challenging, difficult. Why are we doing this day in and day out? Our code might feel oppressive. Right? I think we all that. But I want to encourage you all, don't lose sight of what it is. It's people that make this experience worthwhile and interesting. We're lucky to have mentors. We're lucky to have students. We're lucky to have colleagues and collaborators. That should be celebrated. Don't lose sight of it day in and day out. The relationships you build, you maintain, and you encourage. That's what makes this profession important, right? I mean, I hope that's a perspective that we can hold. We need to find the joy in doing science, but share that joy with others. Right? I mean, that's why we're here. That's why we do this. Okay. Well, at least that's how I've been lucky to have great mentors as well. I want to thank Jonathan, Liam, Ben, Dan, Susan, Robert. All of these people contributed to helping me get to do science as a career, and that's pretty special. Yeah, don't forget to thank your mentors. I think that's important, right? Lots of funding has gone into this. I want to thank some of these organizations, especially recently, National Geographic has been a big supporter. I've also been lucky to work with zoos. Zoos are a great resource. There are a lot of really bright people working in zoos, and they want to contribute to understanding not only conservation, but also like the origin of biodiversity. So call up your local zoo and talk to somebody there. All right, well, I think getting close on time. So thank you all again. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's been great to meet you all, talk with you all. I'm happy to take some questions if I have time.
Thank you. That was such a fantastic talk. I'm also glad to have you here. Are there any questions from the in-person crowd at the moment? James Stroud?
I've got two questions. Sorry. How many more Boas do you think there are still for you to find? And why did one never get to the Florida Peninsula?
Yeah, okay, two great questions. Every talk that I give that person. I think there's more out there. I'm not going to tell you where I think they are. I think there might be maybe one more. We think they might have gotten to the Florida Peninsula. The Straits of Florida are a difficult biogeographic barrier for a lot of terrestrial wildlife, but there is a group of fossils from northern Florida Peninsula near Gainesville that have been described as having belonged to at least 3 different genera of Boas. Most recently put into the genus Chilobothris, which is this genus. And those fossils date to the late Miocene. So we think that they possibly either colonized across the Straits of Florida that long ago, or perhaps more probably, they were distributed across the southeastern US. So there could have been a mainland representative. Now, I was talking about this earlier today. I'm not sure how much weight we want to put on that because the fossils are in kind of bad shape. So the fact that they've been described as 3 different genera suggests that some of those diagnostic characters are tricky. So I don't know. I think it's possible, and perhaps the fossils suggest it's plausible that they occurred in Peninsula Florida. But I think the jury's still out a little bit. But we put some of that into the book just as an example. Yeah. How was that? Yeah.
Other interesting questions?
Thanks a lot for the fantastic talk. Just have a question. It might not be like relevant to yourself, but is there like a way, or are you interested in like sort of practicing or knowing what the relative importance of these like contingencies or determinism versus stochasticity? Is there a way to quantify that?
Yeah, so I think there is. One of the impediments that we run into is a lack of sufficient natural history knowledge to be able to parameterize the models. And I tried to sort of illustrate that with the fact that we lack dietary data for some of these species. So I think what we are trying to do now is to incorporate all these new species that we described and generate enough data about them to then be able to go back and sort of get a better estimate of the relative, proportional perhaps contribution of each of these to the evolution of this lineage. So, but I think that the overall idea is that we want to think about how all 3 of these have contributed. And I don't know that we'll be able to get fully a proportional contribution. It kind of depends on what aspect we're sort of thinking about. Because even for things like, for the evolution of small body size, and that's comprised of mechanisms that are contingent, deterministic, and also stochastic. So, again, it's not surprising that all three of those contribute to biodiversity outcomes, but we want to know sort of how and in what way. And that's an unsatisfying answer, I know, but I'm not sure that I could actually be pinned down this thing, that we could do a full understanding of proportional contribution.
Thank you. Really, I think it's very challenging.
Yeah.
Topic.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great talk. We get two questions from the online audience. The first one is from Stella. She said, a very interesting talk. To what extent do you think habitat specialization might be related to dietary specialization? Perhaps because similar prey use similar habitats, and how are used on diet?
Yeah, so that's a good one. Yeah, so undoubtedly they're related. So, and for example, one of the specialized diets that we see are anolis lizards. Well, it turns out that the story is a little more complicated because in some of these large generalist species, the juveniles are actually specialists on anolis lizards. And so that's related to this idea that those small species are sort of neotenic in that way, right? And so the story is a little bit more complicated than I presented. But yeah, so anolis lizards, many of them are arboreal, right? So it's plausible that dietary and habitat specialization are related. And I think we would undoubtedly uncover that with better dietary data. And the second part of that question is, how do we study diets? And that's a challenging thing, right? I mean, there's a classic way of looking inside the animals, but snakes don't eat very often. And so it's hard for us to find that out. And so, the goal would be to use things like isotope to try to get an idea of the contributions of different prey types to their diets. And that's something that we would love to get started, but that's challenging to do. Some of these species, we can't find very many at all. Some of these species we have maybe a dozen sightings of. And one of them, the silver boa, well, there's only 200 total, right? So it's gonna be difficult to do that, but great questions. I think we'll continue to build that database.
Thank you for the amazing talk. I have a question about the evolution of small body size. Do we know that the ancestral boa had a large body size?
Yeah, so reconstruction of ancestral character states can be fraught and tricky. What our data suggests so far is that ancestral boas were probably on the larger body size. But we have not tested that with the new data. And I didn't show this either, but we have a new phylogeny based on the new species and UCE data. So it's actually a fully resolved phylogeny. It's going to be a little more powerful for testing some of these ideas. So yeah, I guess the answer is we don't know, but but it looks like based on what we have so far that small body size is evolving in situ, and that the colonists, the ancestors, were probably either medium or large body size.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thank you for the awesome talk. And I have a question about sexual dimorphism, because you showed some pretty extreme examples.
Yeah.
How do they play into the diet and habitat specialization?
Right, that's a great question. So that species that I showed you, the really extreme male and female, that species is almost entirely feeding on lizards. And the interesting thing that's happening there is that up to a certain size, there's a bunch of different lizard species that they can eat, anoles and geckos. But the females achieve a body size that's big enough to eat iguanas. And so these iguanas, they can get up to 3 kilograms in size. And the females, the big female boas, can take down some of those big iguanas. So what we're seeing is the females can reach a large enough size to access a whole new food resource that none of the other boas can. And so that's an ecological partition in terms of diet. And females are unlocking a new dietary item. They're all lizards, but that's a very different type of prey item. So, in this context, we would refer to them as being saurophagous. They all eat lizards, but that's not the full story, right? There's something else going on there where there's some ecological partition. such that they're probably not competing for food once they achieve adult body size.
Can I ask you a follow-up?
Sure.
Do you think the sex of dimorphism is the males getting smaller or the females evolving bigger?
Yeah, that's one of the next things that we will look into. That species that I showed you that for, that's the one that we've studied the most. I have 1,472 samples of boas. That's how many we found over the years of that species. So we actually have a pretty rich data set to test some of those ideas. So that's coming because we want to know, is there something happening here that the females just start growing really fast, as they reach a certain age? What age is that when that's happening? Those kinds of questions. So yeah, we finally have a data set to be able to do that. So yeah, good question.
And Jonathan also sees research online. He has a question. Is there a biogeographic component to your model of boa size evolution? That is, large boas are present on some islands and not others. Does that affect the evolution of small size?
Yeah. So yeah, great question. So what we see is that most of the islands that have boas, they have one large one. So Jamaica has one large one, Cuba has one large one, Hispaniola has one large one, but also 3 small ones. Puerto Rico and Mona has one large one, but 2 small ones. The Lucayan Archipelago has one large one and 4 small ones. So we find singleton species, and in those cases, they're always large. I don't know if we got that or not, but yeah, so in terms of the biogeography of it, that's the kind of pattern we're seeing. And so we think that when we're seeing in situ speciation, that's when we're seeing divergence into specialists in general.
There's one more question from Susan Renier. Thank you for the nice talk. I'm very familiar with the IUCN assessments of snakes, probably especially boas. What are your thoughts on the extinction risk of those island species?
Yeah, we are really worried about some of them. The silver boa, that's a really tough one because they're in, pretty bad shape from a conservation standpoint. And this is a question I get often is, why are silver boas on an uninhabited island doing so poorly? Why is their population size so small? What's the deal? And the answer to that simply is that the reach of humans goes beyond where we live. And so that island has been hugely impacted by people, both cutting and burning of the forest, and that's why there's silver forest left, introduction of invasive species, those kinds of things. So some of these species are right on the brink of extinction, and the silver boa is the best example. I mean, it's entirely possible that species could go extinct in the next 10 years. That's a reality. We hope that reality doesn't unfold. They're right there. Some of the others, like the Virgin Islands boa, is also in really bad shape. U.S. Fish and Wildlife tried to downlist the Virgin Islands boa 2 years ago, based on some data that suggested the population size was large. What they didn't account for was that when Hurricane Maria came through Puerto Rico Bank, one of those island populations that had 1/3 of the known census count of the species went extinct. And so, we lost 1/3. And so that does not suggest robust long-term survival. So some of these, we're pretty worried about in terms of their prospects. What do we do about that? Well, some of you are coming to the zoo tomorrow, and the St. Louis Zoo has an ex situ breeding program for the Virgin Islands folks. And we would love to start that with some of the other species. I mean, ex situ breeding, that's an extreme conservation measure. You don't always want to do that. It's expensive, you got to take animals out in the wild, but it's kind of a last resort situation.
All right.
Oh, Liz.
So I know you found support for Model 2. Can you talk about how they're getting across these islands? Oceanic islands are super hard to cross. Do they have a super thick leather egg that can make it across? Are they rafting on whatever chunks of island that are floating off? How are they moving between these islands?
Great question. They don't love to swim, all of them, but some of them they do like to be in the water, like to soak. And so you can imagine if they're soaking, they might get washed out. But one of the interesting things that we found recently is we did a radio tracking study on one of the islands where we found radio transmitters, and we had no expectation that this would be the case, but many of our animals ended up foraging way out in the mangroves. And so I went out and radio tracked one individual. I had to wait for a black-tip shark to swim past me before I could get out to where the boa was. So they're actually accessing areas where they become really vulnerable to being swept off these islands. Furthermore, so they are live bearing. So, you know, a gravid female could be washed out pretty easily. And some of these have litters of 50 to 60 babies, the big ones. And when we look at those reconstructions of the islands, we see that there's actually the distances between some of those paleo islands are pretty small. And even now, I was telling somebody this earlier today, when you look at, say, the Lucayne Archipelago, the southeastern terminus of that are the Turks and Caicos Islands, and then between there and Hispaniola, you actually have 4 banks that are currently submerged that would have been emergent not too long ago. And those would act as perfect stepping stones. And in fact, we see evidence of 2 dispersal events from Hispaniola to the Lucayne Archipelago, probably via those stepping stones. So the actual distance they have to travel has not probably ever been that far. Nevertheless, they don't do it all the time, right? So that's that sweepstakes dispersal.
We're out of time, folks, but let's outside of the reception. Let's thank Graham one more time for the seminar.